Well, hello and welcome to another edition of CAF Warbird Tube. Joining me from Madison, Wisconsin, Chris Kolakowski from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Chris, glad to have you back on the show.
Great to be back, Steve.
Yeah, we're going to kind of venture. We'll still stay in the aircraft lane, but we're going to kind of go the wet foot and the Navy route and talk about one of the most famous people in World War II, and that is Chester Nimitz.
Yeah, one of our greatest admirals, and for my money, one of the finest strategic leaders this country has ever produced, for sure.
All right. Well, we'll talk about Admiral Nimitz's career and his transition from being a submariner to commanding aircraft carriers. It's quite a remarkable story. We'll get into that in just a couple of minutes. And again, Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. If you'd like to find out more about the CAF, our aircraft, our local units, we still have some aircraft out on tour this year, and how you can be a part of the fun, just go ahead and visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you're watching tonight, if you like what you see, please share it across your social media platforms. And if you subscribe on YouTube, click the bell icon, and you'll get the notifications when our new shows are posted. Now, as Chris and I are talking tonight, you might have some questions. We'd love to hear from you. Just type any questions you have in the chat box. We'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off. So with that, let's dive right in, literally, to the career of Admiral Chester Nimitz.
So Chester Nimitz, for those of you who are familiar with World War II, particularly World War II in the Pacific, of course, his name comes up faster than most everybody else's. And what I want to do tonight is give you a sense of who he was, a little bit of his background, but spend most of the time talking about how he influenced the Pacific War, particularly in the really critical first couple of years of his time as a CINCPAC, as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Theater. Talk a little bit about his scope of responsibilities, get people to understand a little bit more, because he really was one of the probably top 2 or 3 major personalities in World War II in the Pacific, for sure. So here's a little bit of background about who he is. Chester Nimitz was born in Fredericksburg, Texas on the 24th of February, 1885, which, by the way, is where the National Museum and why the National Museum of the Pacific War is there today. It's in the old Nimitz Hotel. Nimitz's grandfather had served in the German Merchant Marine, and they had emigrated to the United States just before the Civil War, not that long before the Civil War, and became part of what is a fairly prominent German-American community in that part of Texas. New Braunfels, Texas, for example. That's a whole presentation in itself. He actually wanted to go to West Point. He has ancestors in the German Army and was interested in going to West Point, but his grandfather had also been talking to him and telling him sea stories. There wasn't a slot available at West Point, but his congressman in the area said, you know what, I do have one to the Naval Academy. Great, I'll take it. So he went off, 1905, graduate of the Naval Academy. Goes into destroyers, and this is a lesson in how it's a different Navy 100 and some odd years ago than it is today, is when he's officer of the deck of a destroyer, he's been commissioned a year or two at best, runs the destroyer aground. And basically he gets off with a letter of reprimand and just, don't do it again, be careful. In today's Navy, and this has been said more than once, Ensign Nimitz would never have made lieutenant in today's Navy. And it's an interesting commentary on how the Navy culture has changed for reasons that we don't necessarily, beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. But it is an interesting sort of thing, and it influences his leadership. If you see some of his leadership later, he tends to give people second chances. If you fail while doing something, or if you learn from your failures, he'll give you a second chance. You may not get a third chance, but he'll give you that second chance because he understands. He also recognizes that sailors are people, and you rise and fall in the Navy on people. Matter of fact, I've always said that the greatest sea stories turn on the human factor, which is a whole presentation in itself for a whole other time, Steve. But, it gives you an idea. You see how these formative experiences, and you can see it in other officers of other branches, the formative experiences as a junior influence them as the senior. And so it's a fascinating sort of vignette there. He ends up going into the submarine service, which at the time In the late first decade of the 20th century is brand new. The hull numbers are single digits, SS1, all the way up. Very, very, he's on the front lines of this new emerging undersea technology. He actually goes to Germany before World War I because he's fluent to go visit German dockyards and study German U-boats. And of course, the German U-boats, you see what they did and almost brought Britain to her knees in World War I. And so he's very much on the cutting edge of all of this, and actually is a key player in anti-submarine warfare and in U.S. submarine operations in the Atlantic during World War I. After that, he gets into surface Navy, actually commands cruiser Augusta in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt is aboard her. That's really where he starts to come to the prominent attention lately of Franklin Roosevelt. And then in 1939, he's chief of the Bureau of Navigation, what's that mean? It's an archaic title for chief of personnel. So he's the head of the Navy personnel department. And if you know anything about Franklin Roosevelt, Roosevelt took a personal interest in Navy personnel. And because he was an old Secretary of the Navy, in fact, George Marshall told him once, "I'd really wish, sir, if you would stop referring to the Navy as we and the Army as they." So that gives you an idea of Franklin Roosevelt and his personal identification for the United States Navy, which also means that after Pearl Harbor, after Husband Kimmel is losing his job, they need to find a permanent new commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet out in Hawaii. And Franklin Roosevelt tells the chief of naval operations, tell Nimitz to get out to Pearl Harbor and stay there until the war is won. FDR has found his man, and Chester Nimitz is that man. And so Nimitz will go to Honolulu and will take command on the deck of the submarine Grayling, which is completely appropriate, by the way, particularly considering the dolphins that Nimitz wears. But it's also one of the heaviest ships we still have, is the Grayling. So he takes command on the deck of the Grayling there on the 31st of December, 1941. And he will be in command as commander of the Pacific Fleet and ultimately commander-in-chief of the Pacific Ocean areas, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, all the way through the end of the war. It's one of the longer combat commands a U.S. officer holds in the entire war. So, but there's Nimitz there in the center. Nimitz very early sets the tone. Now, if you know anything about the Pacific War, you know that when he takes command, it's a very dark time. Actually, when he walks into Kimmel's old office, a lot of Kimmel's staff is convinced that he's just going to sweep out with a broom. So, I'm going to give you a second chance. This could have happened to anybody. Let's get out. Let's get on with it. Let's get out there and let's do what we can and do what we need to do to both rebuild the fleet, but also take the war to the Japanese. And of course, for those of you who are familiar with the Pacific Theater, you know that Japan, which has attacked, if you look at the map here, Japan kind of in the top center of the map, has attacked southward and conquers most of what you see on the map west of the international date line, which is that dotted line that you see right there. They do that in the first 6 months of after Pearl Harbor, after December 7th, 1941. They threaten Australia. They take part of New Guinea. They take the Philippines. They take Dutch East Indies. They take Sumatra. They invade Burma, China. I've lectured on this before, so you probably can find that episode. So the Japanese are running rampant all over the Pacific, and the American battleship fleet has been crippled at Pearl Harbor, which was considered the key of the fleet. So one of the only things that Nimitz has to strike back with, aside from submarines, and there's not that many of them, is the aircraft carriers. You've got 5 of them, and you can see the list of them right there if you squint and look in real carefully. And so what he does is he decides we may not be able to hit hard, but we can hit the Japanese. And you see all those little blue explosions? Those are carrier raids that Nimitz sends his task force commanders out to go strike the Japanese in January, February, and March of 1942. And the whole idea is to strike at the periphery of the empire, and the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, at Wake, Marcus. They get down into the Southwest Pacific and strike New Guinea. And the idea is just to remind the Japanese that the United States Navy is still here. And it also sets an aggressive tone for his headquarters. because they're planning offensives. It'd be real easy to fall back into a defensive crouch after Pearl Harbor, right? But when you start getting these small victories against the Japanese, first of all, it's training, it's experience, but it's confidence. And so you're building that with the Pacific Fleet. And of course, the culmination, probably the most famous of all of these, is the one that Franklin Roosevelt directs and Nimitz helps execute, is the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, the famous 30 seconds over Tokyo in April of 1942, which is kind of the culmination of this. Nimitz had a hand in putting that together. He was the one who put the task force together, Enterprise and Hornet. And even though the plan originated in Washington with Hap Arnold and with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Nimitz is the executive agent for that. And he was the one who puts William Halsey in charge, go bomb Tokyo. So Nimitz is very quickly setting a tone, but he's also establishing a very active hand in the conduct of the war. He's becoming very much a major player. The old saw, when you're in command, command. Yeah. And that's exactly what Nimitz is doing. He's in command, and he's going to command and take the fleet out and try and set the right tone for when an opportunity may present itself.
And an interesting point that you've made here is that for many people, when they're studying World War II history, they see the Doolittle raid as that first strike. And it is the first strike at mainland Japan. I understand that. But right. These smaller carrier excursions and attacks that are going on early in 1942, and sometimes when you look at the history of the war, the early years are so focused on Europe that you don't realize that there was quite a bit going on in the Pacific, even though it wasn't making the same headlines as it was on the European front.
No, that's absolutely right. Particularly when you think about what's going on at the same time in Europe at this time. Mm-hmm. The Pacific there's far more going. You're right. There's far more going on than people realize, and it's more important than people realize. A lot of people tend to look at not just the World War II, but Pacific or the history sometimes episodically. There's a discrete beginning and a discrete end to this event. But they forget that a lot of these events happen in a continuum. And for example, the battle we're going to talk about here in a minute, Midway, happens as part of a continuum. It's not a one-off isolated event. And in some ways, to understand Midway and understand how that battle's done and how the Navy performs in that battle, you have to understand the preparations and the training and the confidence that they build in the months before. And it's part of that continuum. That's actually the perfect segue, because before December 31st, 1942, Chester Nimitz makes two key decisions that affect the rest of the Pacific War, and from my mind, Allied victory may not have been possible had they been decided differently. The first one is Midway. After the Doolittle raid, Fleet Admiral Yamamoto decides to attack the island of Midway. This is a whole presentation in itself, but for our purposes, I want to focus on Nimitz's decision to accept battle. Nimitz's code breakers in Hawaii and Honolulu had basically given him a very good understanding of the plan that you see in front of you. The attack on the Aleutians to the north, the converging fleets on Midway with the invasion of Midway Island slated for early June of 1942. And, Nimitz is getting this. His boss back in Washington, Ernest King, who it was his daughter said is the most even-tempered man I've ever met. He's always in a rage. So that gives you an idea of what a personality he is. But Ernie King, his team is looking at these intelligence and they're saying, you know what? Midway's not the objective. Hawaii's the objective. Nimitz is like, well, wait a minute. I can test this theory. Have Midway, it's the famous AF is short of fresh water. Have them broadcast into clear. They're having trouble with their freshwater condensers. And sure enough, the Japanese picked that up. AF is short of fresh water. And that's good enough for Nimitz. But King and his team are like, we still think it might be Honolulu. We still think it might be Oahu. But they give Nimitz the decision to do what he wants. Now, Nimitz is basically betting what's left of the Pacific Fleet on the decision and on whether or not to accept battle at Midway. But he realizes, because of the complexity of the Japanese plan and because the vanguard under Chuichi Nagumo, which is the lead elements that are approaching Midway, are actually out of support, there's an opportunity, if he can get his fleet up there and surprise them, that he might do some significant damage. In fact, that's the orders he gives, is you will be guided by the principle of calculated risk. In other words, you will not expose your command to destruction without prospect of inflicting greater destruction on the enemy. That's the mission he gives his two commanders, Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher. That is the decision from which everything else that happens in the Battle of Midway, which in many ways is one of the most important battles in the history of the United States Navy, flows. And it was all Nimitz's decision to accept battle, to accept what his intelligence is telling him, and to plan to ambush the Japanese. And of course, in an audience like this, I know the rest of that story is very well known. But the decision, the courageous decision, we all know it worked out. Nimitz didn't. But he basically pushed his chips into the center of the table and said, we're gonna do it right here. I like the odds in my favor. We're gonna do it here. And it worked out. So after Midway, they reorganized the Pacific Theater and begin to plan a counteroffensive, because the Japanese have now lost the initiative, even though they'll try and still make some offensive moves. The Southwest Pacific area will be Douglas MacArthur's area out of Brisbane, Australia. You can see New Guinea, Netherlands, Indies, up to the Philippines. Everything else on that map, Pacific Ocean areas, the Central Pacific, the North Pacific, and the South Pacific, is Nimitz's. It is one of the largest geographic commands an American has ever had, and it is one of the most unique operating theaters an American commander has ever fought in. Nimitz himself directly commanded the Central Pacific. He had a Northern Pacific admiral, and then he had a South Pacific admiral as well, and we'll talk about the South Pacific guy here in a second. The other thing that should be mentioned about this is that this is the most joint theater America has ever fought in. No one service is going to get you from Honolulu or Brisbane to Tokyo. You need air, sea, and land all working together. The island hopping campaigns, things like that. One of the things that Nimitz very quickly realizes about that is he says, I need an integrated staff. And so he begins to develop what we called it a joint headquarters, where you have Army, you have Navy. He had daily staff conferences. And everybody from any of the subordinate headquarters on Honolulu were welcome to attend. And every single day, without fail, there'd be an update on the war. There'd be decisions that were made, discussions. And he really fostered that. And if you read some of the different accounts, for example, Simon Bolivar Buckner, when he gets there in 1944, the way Nimitz used social occasions as much as anything to build relationships. This was not going to be an Army and a Navy show, although definitely the Navy was in charge. Don't get me wrong. This was not going to be a sole Army, sole Navy, sole Marine Corps show. It was going to be all together, getting where we need to go. And that set a very important tone. Both sides look at Australia. They look at the lines of communication to Australia. And I want you to look real carefully at the Solomon Islands. And you notice how the Solomons is bisected by the theater boundary? That was intentional, because the southeastern part of the Solomon Islands is an island called Guadalcanal, where the Japanese are building an air base. And Nimitz and his South Pacific forces want to take the air base, but they don't want to necessarily work under Douglas MacArthur. I shouldn't say Nimitz doesn't want to work under MacArthur, but there are some of his subordinates, particularly in the South Pacific, that don't want to work under Douglas MacArthur. And so they actually move the theater boundary west to allow Guadalcanal to be in Nimitz's area of responsibility. And actually, Guadalcanal is a perfect example of one of those where the air, sea, and land all have to work together to achieve victory. It's a tremendous case study in that regard. And so they land on Guadalcanal August 7th, 1942. Japanese respond quickly, and this becomes a real meat grinder, and in some ways is the turning point of the Pacific War. But initially, it doesn't go very well for the Americans, which brings Nimitz to his second most important decision of 1942. And this involves personnel. This guy here, Robert Gormley, who is a year behind Nimitz at West Point. Gormley, accomplished officer. He had spent most of the first part of World War II in Europe as a naval observer. So he's got diplomatic, seems to be a pretty nice guy. seems to be able to carry himself in very, complex situations, social situations. He'll later have a diplomatic post at the end of the war as well. Problem is, first of all, he needs dental work. He has abscess teeth. But the big thing is that Gormley is not a forceful personality, and he is somewhat out of his depth as a theater commander. When he's put in command of South Pacific, he's one of those guys that, you know how there's some leaders that no matter what the obstacle is, we're going to find a way to get over it. And then you get other leaders that can only see what the problem is, cannot see the possibilities, cannot see the opportunities. Will always see the negative side of the balance sheet as opposed to the positive side. Gormley's one of those. He sees the negative side of the balance sheet. When he's ordered to attack Guadalcanal, he's like, I can't do this. This is way too fast. And we're not prepared. We're not trained, all this other stuff. Meanwhile, Archer Vandergrift and the Marines are like, you know what? We'll figure it out. Let's let the stevedores in New Zealand are on strike. Fine. The Marines will load the ships. So it's a very different attitude. But when you have that in the Supreme Commander, that begins to permeate down the ranks. Gormley, Nimitz actually goes to visit Gormley a couple times in September of 1942. And he has said, Gormley, go visit Guadalcanal. Mm-hmm. Go be visible. Go see the front. Gormley never went. Twice when Nimitz is talking to him, a key urgent dispatch is brought in. Gormley looks at it and says, my God, what are we going to do about this? And tucks it on the papers in his desk. That's not exactly what you want, the kind of leadership you want to see, right? But here's the thing. Gormley's a year behind Nimitz at West Point, or at the Naval Academy. King knows him well. He is a popular guy. He's a friend. Mm-hmm. But Nimitz realizes this is not who we need. This is not what we need. And so he sends William Halsey down there with sealed orders on an inspection trip. And he writes to King and says, look, this is what I've seen. And King says, you do what you have to do. You are authorized to relieve him. And when Gormley is relieved by Halsey says, this is the hottest potato anybody's ever given me. The Marines actually crawl out of their foxholes and cheer. And if you read accounts of Guadalcanal, this is one of those moments where when the message comes that Gormley's been relieved by Halsey, it's a tremendous shot in the arm of the morale. One of the things that Gormley wouldn't let the Navy people do is take their ties off in this tropical heat. First thing Halsey does, take your tie off. The Air Force, the Army aren't wearing ties with their tropical uniform. There's no reason we should. And of course it turns the campaign. Leadership makes the difference. Both Halsey's leadership, but also Nimitz making the decision to relieve Gormley and realizing that Gormley is just not giving him what he needs in a critical battlefront. And of course, it makes a huge moment, huge turning point in what becomes a great American victory in the Pacific.
Yeah, it is one thing to sort of defy your boss. In reading some of the accounts, Gormley's been, like you said, directed to go to Guadalcanal. Go there. Be the face of command. You should be on there with your command, and he doesn't. And he hesitates and just stays where he is because that's where he was comfortable. Whatever. But that's really not a good way to keep your job. Is if you just don't listen to your boss.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a really good case study. You can find it online. Actually, it's linked to it in the Wikipedia article about Gormley, about the decision to relieve him and the what all went into it. And Gormley's not a dumb guy. He's just overwhelmed and actually does a very credible job. He comes back. He's the naval commander of the Hawaiian Islands for a few years. And then actually Eisenhower wants him and says, I need somebody experienced who's got European experience to help me as we're overrunning German U-boat bases and to kind of assess German naval technology and help with the surrender of the German Navy. So Gormley goes and does that. So it's not like he gets put on the shelf.
Right.
But it's one of those where he's useful, but he's useful in other areas than being commander of the South Pacific.
Making sure that he has a position that it matches his talents.
Exactly. And that's, that's part of being a leader is, the Jim Collins said once, it's getting the right people on the bus, but also getting the right people in the right seats on the bus.
Right.
And particularly when you're at Nimitz's level, that's one of the things you have to do is personnel.
Yeah.
So, of course, speaking of key decisions, this is one here. Nimitz actually is a prime mover in this. Yamamoto is going on a tour of the Solomon Islands and his frontline troops in April of 1943, and U.S. code breaking decodes the itinerary. And there's a debate that goes all the way to Washington as to whether or not they should actually go after Yamamoto and try and shoot him down on this tour. And the question is, would the Japanese guess that we broke their codes? And, some debate in Washington. Ultimately, the Secretary of the Navy and the folks in Washington tell Nimitz, it's your decision. The forces are under your command. It's the South Pacific Air and naval forces that would be required to do this. It's your theater, your responsibility. And his decision is Yamamoto is worth 4 aircraft carriers. And whoever replaces him isn't going to be that good. So let's try it. And on the 18th of April, 1943, 1 year after the Doolittle raid, as a matter of fact, they managed to shoot down U.S. Army Air Force's P-38s, end up shooting down Yamamoto. That's his plane there in the lower right-hand corner, crashed on Bougainville Island. It's still there, by the way. The wreckage is still there. And then, of course, the crew's there on the left and one of the P-38s. By the way, Yamamoto and Nimitz, you'll see a photo of Nimitz later as Chief of Naval Operations, but if you look real carefully at that photograph of Yamamoto, you'll notice that he and Nimitz have something in common. Neither of them have 10 fingers. Yamamoto had lost 2 fingers at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, and you can see his left index and his left middle finger are gone. Nimitz had lost his left ring finger in a mechanical accident in the 1920s, and the only thing that stopped him from losing more than most of his left ring finger was his Annapolis ring, which jammed the machinery. And you'll see a photograph of that later. But I've always thought that's an interesting commonality that the two men share, these two very prominent figures of the first half of the Pacific War, that they both share missing fingers. So, but Yamamoto's off the table and that's Nimitz's decision. Nimitz, he's a big player in the decision, Operation Vengeance, as it's called, the decision to go get Yamamoto.
And that mission in itself could be the subject of a future show as well. There's
absolutely,
as you say, the decision leading up to it, and then not necessarily controversy, but the debate over who pulled the trigger and which airplane and who it was. And like I said, a story for another day.
Well, I'll just say this one thing. Just doing the math on the flight path, measure the flight path of those P-38s from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, and doing the math on what it takes to actually intercept, not to mention navigate it, and that they actually were 2 minutes early on the interception. And they did it without calculators. It's just incredible. Absolutely. You're right. It's all presentation in itself.
There you go.
So, we talked about some of the things about a strategic leader, but one of the things that I want to emphasize, and this is something that is completely forgotten about, and is completely forgotten about Nimitz's leadership, is the influence he has on the Central Pacific campaign. Now, by 1943, the United States is counterattacking Japan. They're launching what's called the dual drive offensive. MacArthur's coming up from Australia through the Solomons, through New Guinea, back toward the Philippines. That's one drive. The second drive is Nimitz's forces coming out of Honolulu, going across and leapfrogging across the Central Pacific, also toward the Philippines and the China coast. The first moves are Tarawa and Macon in November of 1943 in the Gilbert Islands, which is in the very southeastern corner there of the map. It's a very bloody affair. There's a lot of lessons that are learned thanks to Marine and Army casualties on both islands, particularly Tarawa. Nimitz, who is there and observes the action, let's learn them, let's adjust, let's reorganize as we need to, because we're going to go back. That's only step one. We're not stopping. We're going to go forward. Step two is the Marshall Islands, which is the northern part of the map there. And from the Marshalls, then it will go across to the Marianas, which will be June of 1944. So Gilbert's are November of 1943. The Marshalls are January of 1944, January 31st, 1944. And here's where this matters. Here's where Nimitz's leadership makes the difference, because his planners have all been looking at this and saying, you know, there's a lot of islands in it. There's a lot of atolls in the Marshalls. A lot of these are useful for air bases. Some of them are great for anchorages. The Japanese have used this as an important staging area for operations since the war began. The Wake Island invasion fleet in December of 1941 left the Marshall Islands to go attack Wake Island, for example. Let's attack the eastern part of the islands. If you look between the lines of Marshall Islands and a couple of those atolls there to the east, that is, if you could a little bit further up on the cursor there, Steve, and a little bit over, there you go. Yeah, attack there. Let's attack there, secure those bases, and then push west, particularly the big island of Kwajalein, or the big atoll, largest atoll in the world, which is just to the west there. Yeah, right there. And then, having secured Kwajalein, we might then be able to take the Western Marshalls a little bit later. And then it says, you know what? We're doing a great job raiding, and I've got a big enough carrier fleet now, because they've now got a bunch of the new Essex class that have come online. And he says, I've got a big enough fleet now that we can neutralize a lot of those air bases that you're concerned about in the Eastern Marshalls. Let's go straight to Kwajalein. Let's go right into the center. Let's go right for the jugular, because then if we can build Kwajalein into the base that we know we can, not only will it be an important link for us in the westward drive, but it also then becomes the base we can use to keep the Japanese and the rest of the Marshalls pacified for the rest of the war. It's like, well, everybody's just kind of like, well, okay, it's a little, but they do it, and it goes off almost perfectly. Kwajalein falls within a matter of days. It is clear that the Japanese were not expecting such a steep strike into the Marshalls. We find out after the war they were expecting us to do exactly what we were expecting, and Kwajalein falls fairly quickly without using the reserves. And Nimitz had issued another order, and he says, you know what? If you don't need to use the reserves, I want you to go after any Wetak using the reserves, the uncommitted troops. And so on the 17th of February, 1944, under cover of a raid, a truck, which is off the map to the south, a big combined fleet base of truck, they storm ashore at Eniwetok. Within a matter of days, Eniwetok is taken. And this campaign, which the planners had originally thought was going to take months, is measured in weeks. And it starts a pattern that the Japanese will admit after the war, is that consistently the Americans moved faster than the Japanese believed we could do it. And that's Nimitz's aggression. He realizes, let's get them. Let's get them on the back foot. And when we get them on the back foot, keep them on the back foot. And let's use our air power. Let's use our ability to supply troops and ships over long distances. And let's use this massive fleet, 5th Fleet, later 3rd Fleet. Let's use this fleet to support and kind of break open what we need to break open so that our ground troops can then secure the islands and we can continue to leapfrog forward and bypass Japanese where we can and where it's profitable. He test drives that theory, which he then uses all the rest of the war in the Marshalls. And we were talking earlier about forgotten activities that are an essential part of a continuum. Flintlock, which is the code name for the invasion of the Marshalls, and Nimitz's decisions is an essential part of that. And it's also one of those moments where the team, it builds confidence in the team. That the old man knows what he's about, and let's get on with, let's let's learn from this and let's move forward. Now, we talked about the dual drive offensive. Nimitz and MacArthur met a couple of times. Nimitz would usually go to Hawaii, or go from Hawaii down to Australia to go meet MacArthur on his turf. And in that sense, he's exactly like George Patton. Patton always believed, go forward. If you're going to meet with somebody, go to them, particularly a subordinate. Go to them. Partly you're meeting in their position, but also you get to see what's going on with them. And so he goes down, and this is him and MacArthur meeting in early 1944. Nimitz thought highly of MacArthur, actually gave him a set of 4-star collar insignia as a tribute. But Nimitz also kept a photograph of Douglas MacArthur on his desk. And visitors to his office would be like, what is this? Basically, what the hell are you doing with a photo of MacArthur? And Nimitz would always say, that reminds me not to make grand pronouncements. So make of that what you will. But these are two, when you talk about the Pacific War, Nimitz and MacArthur, these two names come up quicker than anything else. And, were there rivalries? Were there jealousies? Was MacArthur mistrustful of the Navy? Absolutely. But when it came down to it, both of these men wanted to win the war. And when they got together, they could figure out a way to work together to win the war. And on more than a few occasions, Nimitz supports MacArthur's operations, and particularly the liberation of the Philippines campaigns. Without the two of them working together, it wouldn't have been possible to do what they ended up doing. So this is the progress of the Pacific War. You can see the results of the dual drive offensives coming up from Australia via New Guinea, and then, of course, west from Hawaii there. And notice the red circles that are appearing in the Central Pacific. Those are isolated Japanese garrisons, of which the easternmost red circle are all those isolated Japanese garrisons that were left behind in the Marshall Islands that we had just talked about. But the big thing, and this is I want to set this up because this actually sets up one of the most important strategic debates of the entire Pacific War, and one, in many ways, it still reverberates today. And that is the question of when the drives begin to approach the Philippines, where do they go? What's the objective? And what it comes down to really is a debate. Do you go to Formosa, which is Taiwan, which is kind of in the center of the map right there, right above the westernmost blue box? Or do you go to the Philippines and Luzon, the northern Philippines? Ernest King wants Formosa. Planners in Washington want Formosa. MacArthur, for obvious reasons, wants the Philippines. Nimitz, being a good subordinate to King, will argue for Formosa. But when pressed, he will also recognize the merits of the Philippines as well. It is this 1944, right after Franklin Roosevelt gets his fourth term, and FDR actually goes to Pearl Harbor to talk with these two guys about what the next steps in the Pacific War should be. And then you'll see, this is actually them when the meeting's about to commence. And you can see, look at the rapport, obvious rapport between FDR and MacArthur. MacArthur had been Chief of Staff of the Army when FDR was president. So they've known each other for a long time. But I love putting his photograph in here. But you can see, Nimitz, dressed to the nines, he's there, he's ready to go. He presents the Formosa case. MacArthur stands up and makes this impassioned plea about, the Philippines. It's U.S. territory. There are U.S. prisoners of war there. By the way, there are Filipino guerrillas that are ready to support us. And Nimitz is seen nodding along with all of this. What it ultimately comes down to is a question of resources. MacArthur correctly points out that you can do the Philippines with the existing resources in the Pacific. Nimitz admits, if we're going to take Formosa, we need reinforcements, particularly service units that are earmarked for Europe. You're not stopping the war in Europe or robbing the war in Europe to take an island in the Pacific. And so ultimately that carries the day, and both Nimitz and MacArthur will support a Philippine campaign to go liberate the Philippines. And on October 20th of 1944, Douglas MacArthur gets his wish. came through and I shall return. He returns to the Philippines. This is him waiting ashore with his staff at Leyte on the 20th of October, 1944. Half of the invasion forces were from the Central Pacific. Most of the supporting fleet that will then fight and win the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is a whole presentation in itself, will be Nimitz's forces. Without Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific, MacArthur doesn't get back there. Significantly, the United States, alone among all the colonial powers, got back and liberated our colonies by the end of the war. The fact that the United States did not abandon the Filipinos, fulfilled the promise, goes a long way to explaining why the United States is a trusted partner in Asia today. So this has reverberations. Here we are, 81 years after. And for much of the world out there, this is yesterday. And to understand the United States' position in Asia, you have to understand this history, because it's top of mind out there for sure. This is Nimitz. You can see this is his official portrait here as Chief of Naval Operations after the war. You can see his injured hand. We had alluded to that earlier. Nimitz will be one of the 5-star officers promoted in December of 1944. He ranks one day after Douglas MacArthur, MacArthur being December 18th, Nimitz being December 19th. And he is one of 4 American admirals to wear 5 stars. Then, of course, focus on victory in the Pacific. Iwo Jima will be his aegis. Okinawa will be his aegis. He will be the naval commander designate for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Of course, the atomic bombs render that moot. He will sign the surrender on behalf of the United States on the deck of the USS Missouri. Douglas MacArthur accepted on behalf of all allies, and then each country nominated somebody to represent their country. And the person that represented the United States of America at that ceremony is Chester Nimitz. And to my mind, he more than earned it, because he's one of the most important architects of victory in the Pacific. He'll be Chief of Naval Operations until 1947. Probably one of the most important things he does is he encourages a young submarine officer named Hyman Rickover to continue his experiments with nuclear power and start looking at a nuclear-powered battle fleet with effects that we, of course, are apparent to us today. He retires to the San Francisco Bay Area, remains active in the community, and dies in February of 1966. He's buried in the Golden Gate National Cemetery next to several of his subordinates, all of whom had agreed to be buried in a line along with their wives while they were still alive. I visited his grave. It's actually a very beautiful cemetery. If you ever get a chance, if you're ever in the Bay Area and you have a little bit of time, go check it out. It's actually really well done. And it says so much that every single one of them has a standard U.S. government headstone, just like any other sailor. And to me, that says a great deal about Nimitz as well. So I would encourage everybody tonight, again, we've given a very brief summary, but I look forward to questions. But I also want to encourage people to read more about Nimitz. Craig Simons has a great book out called Nimitz's War. It came out a couple of years ago. Highly, highly recommend, about him as Supreme Commander. Nimitz is one of the greatest strategic leaders this country has ever produced. And he deserves more study, and he deserves more attention. Not that he doesn't get attention now, but he deserves more even now. And so with that, Steve, I'll throw it back to you, and thanks for playing along.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Chris, for always an entertaining presentation. One of the things that when I was looking through the slides is looking at the picture of Admiral Gormley. And it's probably not the best picture of him, but he looks very old. And just in my mind, I thought, well, how old were these admirals at the beginning of World War II? So I went back and looked. In 1941, Gormley was 58, right? Admiral Pye was 61. Halsey was 59. And the youngest of them, Nimitz, he was only 56. So it was just an interesting contrast. And then as I was starting to think about the years, also the fact that, Nimitz was in the submarine corps, and then graduating from the Naval Academy, 1905, less than 2 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. And then,
right,
just a couple of decades later, he's in charge of the aircraft carrier fleet in World War II, something that didn't exist when he graduated from the academy. So that leap in technology that happened, in those years, it was just amazing.
it's a generation that and MacArthur is this way, Hap Arnold is this way, Billy Mitchell is this way. It's a generation that sees so much technological change. You know, a lot of these people grew up like, you know, Texas was the old West when young Chester Nimitz was growing up. And here he is, when of naval operations, it's the atomic age. Yeah. And when he dies, we've shot rockets. So it's an incredible period of change. And you look at some of these, some of the ones that really make an impact in World War II, you find them already involved in some of this change earlier. Hap Arnold, Nimitz with submarines. You know, you look at some of the others, aviation folks, but even armor, George Patton. You know, in the internal combustion engine and what it means even for logistics, George Marshall. And you look at all of these people that are embracing this change and really kind of rolling with it and seeing how they can harness it for the future. It not only propels them to success, but it also helps them identify kindred spirits. To me, it's absolutely no accident the submarine pioneer got along with these aviation pioneers, because they're kindred spirits. He understands what it's like to basically be writing the book on a new type of warfare, which is basically what Halsey and, you know, all those other, Fletcher and Spruce, that's what they're doing in 1942. And Nimitz understands that. He also understands what he doesn't know, but he also recognizes smart people, kindred spirits, and then gives them the opportunity to go out there and do what they can do.
And you just hit on something else, and you know, you read leadership books and things like that, and two of the things that always stick out to me is trusting your people, get the right people around you, right? Which he did, 100%. Like you said, you know, but like Halsey, I mean, they and Spruance, they're, as you said, writing the book on aircraft carrier operations. Nimitz realizes he doesn't know everything, so he lets his subordinates do their best. Right, and takes their recommendations and makes his own decisions, but he takes their recommendations and listens to them, right? And also, as you also pointed out, allows people to make a mistake. And it is one of those things. It's like you make a mistake, learn from it, move on, don't make that mistake again. Another hallmark of good leadership. And again, that was in the 1940s, and it is still true today. Those are some key attributes that he possessed.
No, I agree. And, you know, it's all about setting the direction. And when you're at that level or you're a strategic leader, one of the biggest things you can do is set the direction and set the purpose of the organization. And then once you give those missions and you give those orders, then the team goes out and does what they're going to do. You know, and you provide the resources, you know, you help resource, you help, you know, there's a lot you do too. But setting that mission, setting that purpose makes a big difference. The other thing I'll mention, I didn't really get into this, is the personal angle of Nimitz's leadership. We alluded to some of that with social, you know, and his ability to really, you know, be personable. He was a pretty friendly guy. But one of the other things is, if you showed up like Captain Steve Buss, if you showed up commanding a destroyer and reported to Honolulu, and you were on your way to the Pacific Fleet, you had an office call with SyncPAC. Even if it was 5 minutes, he just wanted to meet his ship captains. You know, hey, how you doing? Have you got what you need? You know, give a little bit of personal touch, both so that he could see who he's commanding, but also so that they could get a little bit of something. You know, get that message, get that purpose right from the SyncPAC himself.
Another hallmark of leadership.
Absolutely.
Yeah. By the way, Scott Halverson dropped a question in. He says, when can we get the webinar on Admiral Yamamoto? We'll schedule that.
Well, you know, Steve, I think we've identified several webinars we need to put in the hopper at some point. I would love to do Yamamoto. I find him to be a fascinating figure from many standpoints. And so if the audience is requesting one, Steve, let's do it.
That's good. And I know Yamamoto studied here in the States, and this is just a wild question. He and Nimitz never crossed paths when Yamamoto was in the States, did they? that you know of?
Not to my knowledge. I've never looked at that question though, and I may be wrong, but not to my knowledge.
Yeah, would be interesting.
Yeah, you got me. I'm going to look it up when we get done here.
There you go. So just a couple of minutes left, and if the audience has any other questions, go ahead and ask them in. But one of the things we talked about with the technology moving on is not only the World War II technology, but then the jet age that comes right after World War II, and how that in the next 10 years accelerates not only naval aviation, but the Air Force as well, and continues to do so.
Absolutely, it's another time of tremendous technological change, and the nuclear navy.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not just air technology; it's the nuclear navy. USS Nautilus is 10 years after World War II ends. The B-52 is on the drawing boards in 1945 as a 4-engine piston engine aircraft. And of course, 1952, it takes its first flight, B-52. It's still in service today. I mean, and then you start looking at the evolution of the fighter aircraft. It's another time of tremendous change. This is even before you get into satellite technology and everything else in the early with the space race in the 60s. But that 10 to 15 years after World War II is another period of just incredible change. The F-4 Phantom, to me, is one of those great examples of how, you look at the development of the F-4 Phantom and the time frame. First of all, the compressed time frame, but what it took to actually make that aircraft work, and how they started, and they were doing this in the shadow of World War II in Korea, when you still got, P-51s flying around. It's amazing. It really is something. It's impressive, is what it is. Very good.
We've got a couple of minutes left. Anything you'd like to highlight from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum? I know you had some cemetery tours just recently that went over quite well.
Thank you. Yeah, so we just finished our 27th edition of cemetery tours at Forest Hill here in Madison. We highlighted stories this year for the 80th anniversary, including, by the way, a B-24 crew, and later held in Stalag Luft 3. He got there shortly after the Great Escape, but he was in the same camp. So you can find all that on our website. The other thing is we've got a D-Day special exhibit up right now, partly a traveling exhibit with artist Keith Rocco, and partly collection stories from our collection of Badgers in the invasion of Normandy, and that's going to be up in Madison, and you have time within the next week. This was the anniversary of the USS Cole bombing on October 12th, and one of the 12 sailors who was killed in that attack was from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, Mark Nieto. And we have some of his stuff on permanent display. Anniversary, we pulled out his dress whites, and we pulled out a few other items that his family had donated in particular. And we have those on a special display case. And we also have an online exhibit. So if you're further from Madison and you can't make it, we do have a really nice online exhibit that I would highly, highly recommend as well. So, and there, as always, feel free to look through our website, whizvetsmuseum.com, our oral histories. We've got 2,900 and counting. Our online collection, if you want to go down a rabbit hole, feel free to do so. There's plenty there for sure.
Very good. Well, and this has just given us enough time for a couple more questions to come in, which is good. What do you think of the decision to give a 5-star to Halsey but not Spruance?
I don't like it.
Yeah.
And not that Halsey doesn't deserve it. Halsey deserved it for Guadalcanal. Raymond Spruance should have gotten a 5th star. Had Raymond Spruance been a bit more of a self-promoter, he probably would have gotten it. But Raymond Spruance should have gotten it, and that's why I don't like it. Bull Halsey, what he did at Guadalcanal, that's a leadership case study in itself. Earned him his 5th star, and he's been described as a seagoing George Patton with the profile and the pugnacity to match, and I would agree with that. But Spruance definitely should have. In fact, if you ask the Japanese, The most feared admiral that they faced was Raymond Spruance. So they certainly probably would have given him a 5th star too. So make of that what you will.
There you go. Do you think the Vincennes Act 1 and 2 played a role in the decision to commit forces to Midway?
I'm sorry, the what?
The Vincennes, Vinsonact 1 and 2.
I'm not familiar with what those are.
Yeah.
Now, Carl Vinson was in Congress at the time.
Right.
Yeah, the decision was Nimitz's. If there was any external factors that were influencing that decision, it was more the question of what resources do I have available, and how much am I risking? I will say that he knew that there was a lot of carriers that were being built in the United States at the time, and that might be what they're referring to, those appropriations bills, which had been passed in 1940. So he knew that, but at the end of the day, he has to fight and win or lose with what's on hand. Okay. And a lot of Essex class carriers aren't coming online for another year. So you got to fight and win with what you got. And that was true in Guadalcanal, just like it was true at Midway. And so to me, my reading, that is the greatest part of the calculus, is what do I have now? What am I going to have in the foreseeable future? And what can I bring to bear to the best effect?
Yeah. And just to follow up, the Vincennes Act of 1938 caused the upscaling of naval forces by over 20%.
Okay, that's those appropriation acts.
Yeah.
A lot of those ships, though, haven't come online by the time of the Battle of Midway. But they know they're coming. Ernest King is banking on that fleet to go across the Atlantic and to go across the Pacific, but it's not there yet.
So again, it comes down to what do I have today, and what can I muster? Yeah, very good.
Yep.
All right. Well, Chris, with that, we will kind of wrap things up. And again, thank you for taking time to be with us tonight. And we'll look forward to the Yamamoto webinar. We'll get that on the books probably early in 2026, amazingly, because very shortly we're going to get into our holiday series where we feature the 12 Planes of Christmas for our annual end of the year fundraiser for some of our wings. So lots of those coming up. All right. And thank you for joining us tonight on the show. If you have any comments, please just drop us a line at media@cafhq.org, or if you have an idea for an upcoming show like the Yamamoto show, we're always open to any suggestions, and certainly love hearing from you, our loyal audience. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome, and we hope you come back. And again, if you subscribe on YouTube, click that bell icon, and you'll get the notifications when our new shows are posted. So until next time, for the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have a great night.